All right.
Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Heiser. And today we have our friend and fellow astrologer on as well, Hannah Piper Burns. And this is a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together with astrology. So, yeah, welcome, Hannah. And today we wanted to talk about Icarus. So I'll kind of hand it over to Lori because Lori has a much more prominent Icarus than I do in my chart.
Yeah, so Icarus is a asteroid that both me and Hannah have been working with a bit and have prominent. So we're both gonna share a little bit of our stories and what we've learned and what we found from this asteroid. And we'll start with kind of a little bit of an overview of his story. And we can keep it kind of brief, and Hannah, feel free to jump in wherever you feel like jumping in. Um, so I'm not too familiar with the whole story, but I do know that Icarus is the one that's behind the quote, "Don't fly too close to the sun." He's the one who his dad had created these wax wings for him so that he could fly. But of course, he flew too close to the sun and he melted the wings. Um, Hannah, how much of the story do you want to share?
Yeah, well, just a little color commentary, I guess, is that
Yeah.
it's connected. Sometimes when we talk about the asteroids, something that's been interesting for me is to like think about how all these myths weave together and like rereading
Hmm.
the myths, being like, oh, that's the guy from that story.
Yes.
And so I think the Daedalus and Icarus story relates to the story of the Minotaur. um, King Minos was the sort of he was the cuck, I guess, who built the labyrinth for the Minotaur, and Daedalus designed it. So Daedalus was sort of this kind of Leonardo da Vinci type, like an inventor and an intellectual and a craftsman. And
Hmm.
then he and his son were imprisoned after I want to say Theseus went in to get the Minotaur with Ariadne's help. Um, King Minos thought it must have been Daedalus who knew the labyrinth, who had designed it, imprisoned them. They designed the wings to fly away, and all was going according to plan until Icarus famously flew too close to the sun and plunged into the ocean to his watery grave.
Yeah, which is now called the Icarian Sea.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
cool. Fun
That's
fact.
how it got its name, yeah. I also think it's really cool that the actual asteroid of Icarus, is actually closer to the sun than even Mercury is. It's actually, like
Wow.
I think that's why that's its asteroid.
Yeah,
Because
that's
it's
why it was named.
actually yeah, I think that's why it got its name because it's actually very close to the sun. Um, I've kind of interpreted Icarus in a way as like a place where it can show like what your limited belief system are, or like maybe what you need to be like freed from. I think there's a lot of different ways that a lot of different people have interpreted Icarus. I actually have a kind of funny story with it. So I do a lot of circus work, and I've been performing um, and training for many years, 8 or 9 years or something like that. And my favorite modality through partner acrobatics has been Icarian. And Icarian in acrobatics is any type of partner acro that disconnects fully. So any sort of pop or disconnection between you and the base or the flyer, depending on what you are being at that moment. Um,
Oh, so like if you were to somersault backwards off of someone's like hand platform, that would be
Yeah, that would
carrying.
be a carrion. Typically with acro, it's anybody who lays down, it's called L basing. So when you lay down and put your legs up at a 90-degree angle, this creates like a bone stacking technique that makes you a lot stronger. Because you're using bone stack, you're not using muscle.
Muscles. Mhm.
And a pop is a full release. So it's when you bring the flyer down and then you throw them, you launch them upwards into the air. And so you can do flips. Some people, I mean, there's so many different types of Icarian. And it's worth looking into. It's worth looking up. It's all very, very beautiful and very cool. And that's what a lot of like Cirque du Soleil performers use. And that was just the thing that when I first started, of course, as I've gotten older and done more of it, and then COVID happened, this isn't my main modality anymore because I've kind of leaned away from it a little bit. But this was like the thing that really called to me about acro. Like I really loved the
Mm.
full release and like the freedom I felt with flying. And when I first started really getting into asteroids, I had this moment one day where I realized that Icarus was an asteroid, and I was at an acro workshop, or a festival like a weekend before this, and somebody made a comment about Icarus, and I was like, "What does Icarus have to do with this?" And he was like, "That's where Icarian comes from. Like that's the name of what we're doing right now." And I was like, "Oh my God!" Like I had never put two and two together for whatever reason. I like never really thought about it. And so I came home and went rushing to my my chart to see where it was in my birth chart. And sure enough, Icarus was 1 degree away from my descendant and its partner
Mm,
acrobatics.
I
And
think that's
like
so cool.
it's
mhm.
so funny. It made me
Yeah.
laugh because I was like, well, I literally like have to have a partner to do
Mm-hmm.
this.
Someone's gotta throw ya.
Right. Like someone's got to do it. And to go even deeper than that, I have dated a few of my acro partners as well.
Mm.
So
Uh,
there's even been that like seventh house partnership type of relationship that's included Icarus, that's included all of this. And going along with something that we've talked about a couple times, is how the stories all intertwine together. Because I have looked up where Icarus's dad is in my chart. I'm not going to pronounce his name wrong, so um, but I've looked him up in my chart as well, and he's not prominent for me, but he is in my 11th house in Taurus. Which, I see Taurus as a very like stabilizing energy. And the 11th house is friends and community and in groups. So I do feel like there is this connection between like my friends are giving me the wings that I need. Um, and that's kind of how even though it's I don't have any planets or anything else prominent in Taurus, I do think it's really cool that there is that connection there.
mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really beautiful.
Mhm.
And for folks who might be wondering, like, how do I look up if Icarus is in my chart?
Mhm.
Like, what are the asteroids? We have a whole episode where we talk about that, and we'll like give you all the details on how you can rush home and see if Icarus is prominent in your chart. So,
Yeah.
just to let you know, we'll link that down below as well to make that really easy for you to find. And I
Yeah.
think this is such a good example of all the different ways that we can weave like different astrological interpretive techniques together
Mhm.
because you have Icarus conjunct your descendant, and
Right.
then the mythology of Icarus has something to do with the way you partner with other people and the way you date other people. And it shows up
Mhm.
very topically specific. Like it's not that Icarus is conjunct your sun or your ascendant or your moon or something that has more to do with your whole identity. And then,
Right.
that Icarian myth would show up in your whole life. It's showing up in how you partner with people because it's in your seventh house, which I just think is
Yeah.
such a cool example.
And to bring it even farther too, my 11th house is ruled by Venus, which I have in Pisces conjunct my MC and my moon in Aries, in my ninth house. of travel. And so I have struggled so hard to find an Icarian partner in Cincinnati, where I live. And I've ended up having to travel all over the world in search of people who are at my skill level to do this with. And it got to a point where that part wasn't worth it anymore, and COVID happened. And so I literally had this Capricorn seventh house roadblock of at the very beginning of my Saturn return, where I had to actually step away from a lot of that Icarian stuff. And I literally just went to my first Icarian workshop on Sunday that I've been to in a long time. So it is something I'm getting back into, and I do it again still, but it looks very different than it did in the past. And so it is kind of funny how it all, like, with transits and everything, it does change and it does shift, but it always has been like a really prominent piece of my life.
That's
And
beautiful.
I will add real quick, Icarus is 1566 if you're looking up asteroids.
Mm.
That's his number.
1566.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really cool. I also have Icarus, like I said, pretty prominent in my chart. It's not conjunct any of my big three, but it is conjunct my Jupiter. And Jupiter is the host of a stellium in Sagittarius that includes my chart ruler and my moon. So it's a pretty, it's Jupiter's hosting quite a lot from the third house in Capricorn. And it's my least dignified planet. And if we've talked about dignity, that sort of means the least resourced, the furthest from home in terms of its ability to access resources that it might be used to. And I had thought about bringing up that planet because I actually met Alicia in a workshop where we were kind of embodying and enacting the feelings of those wayward, quote unquote, planets. And something that's really struck me about that Jupiter in Capricorn for me is that it's in a house that has a lot to do with mindset and how the environment affects your mindset. And it also is a cadent house. And the thing about a cadent house is like it's almost like a flushing, like things are always like coming out and going in and coming out and going in. You're sort of being carried off and back. And like cadent communication is something that's always been something that I feel trapped by. So I'll get stuck in these things where it's like I'll have a podcast or an email or a blog, and or even expanding out, like I used to run a film festival, and just like feeling trapped to the wheel of time of like you're only as good as your last one, and then you, as soon as it's done, you have to like do it again and again and again. And that feeling really resonated with me as like an example of like an expander ray, like Jupiter. I always say like you have to be careful where you point that thing. And it just like making that issue, that cadency, like louder in my life. And in this very Saturnian, like feeling trapped by time, but also sort of like this, the climbing aspect of Capricorn, and this idea of, for about 10 years, I was working full time, and I was making art full time, and I was trying to juggle both of these careers. And it led me to this really, really intense burnout in the middle of COVID. And thinking about Icarus, which is conjunct my Jupiter in Capricorn, and this idea of burnout, of like you're it's almost like you're climbing and climbing and climbing, and the reward you get for that climb is disintegration. And it's like that feeling of like you've gotten everything you wanted, but it's also like undoing you. And
Right.
thinking about that feeling that Icarus must have had as he was like plummeting, and that at first he probably didn't know that he was falling and he was just like sort of in ecstasy. And then like the idea of like when you hit the water, you're like going down. It's not like that he just smacked the water and was floating. Like he was probably like, if you've ever jumped off a cliff like into water or something, like you go down and then you have to come back up, like, and you've got the wind knocked out of you and you're like frantically kind of like trying to get back up to the surface. And that's kind of
Yeah.
how it felt for me with the burnout, except in a very earthy way. I always described it as like in a cartoon when a character's like running and they aren't running, they're like running in place and like just churning up dirt and bury, like they're going into the earth because they're running so fast and not going anywhere. Oh, hi Kiki. Uh,
You want to say hi?
I also have a tuxedo cat. Oh. Um, but
Okay.
yeah, and just that idea that like once you stop, you're like dug in and you have to dig yourself out. And so that idea too of like this idea of like you think you've freed yourself, but then you have just dug yourself a deeper hole. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because all of the resources that were put into creating the wings were things that they like had around the house too. Like it wasn't like they went out and collected and bought all these resources for it. It was like a handmade, like, look, I did this by myself and it didn't work.
Over years and years and years. Like I spent all this time
Right.
crafting this escape mechanism,
Yeah.
and it turned out to be the uh my, the site of
Yeah.
my undoing, you know.
And that feels very similar to my story as
Mhm.
well, actually, because I remember COVID hitting and I was literally at the peak of like where I was with my strength. Like I was the strongest I've ever been. I was in the best shape I've ever been. I finally had like worked through all of this like fear that I had because I carry it. It's scary. Like there's a lot of risk with it. Like that's the highest risk part of acro. Like
I
it is. And so I had like really worked through a lot of fear. I had finally found a consistent partner who um I really trusted and worked well with, which is very rare and hard to find. And I was like in a really good place with traveling. I had like met every single person in America who like really trained it. And like it was just, it finally felt like I was seeing rewards for the payback. And then COVID hit. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, well, you can't travel anymore. And your main partner lives in Pittsburgh. So guess you can't go there anymore. You know, it's a 5 hour drive. And so it was just like a very abrupt halt where it was like, well, now what do I do? Because that's my skill, but I can't do it alone. And so
wow.
who am I without this skill? Who am I without these things that I've created for myself? And then there was a whole lot of like having to process all of that. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I definitely see, my seventh house, my dating life is very much similar to that too. But I definitely see those Icarus themes come out like very clearly in so many ways, not just the like obvious.
Yeah. It's so interesting too, the way you guys are describing like Icarus's heights and plummets and like going up and falling
Yeah,
and
very high
the
highs, very
way
low lows.
Mhm.
and the way that I was first introduced to Icarus's mythology was from an organization called the Icarus Project that is
Oh,
for people who are bipolar and people who have like mood disordered
interesting.
mental health issues. And I
Mm,
myself am bipolar and So the like idea of Icarus being like can represent this mania, and you fly too close to
Mm,
the sun, you think you're superhuman, and then the gods humble you and you crash and you plummet, and then you have
yeah.
your more underworld, like lower experience. I like the imagery that Hannah painted of being down in the water and like down in the muck and the depths, and the way that Icarus in a chart can represent the ways that our fortunes may kind of have these really massive changes at certain points, especially for people who have that prominent in their chart.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because I actually have Vesta um 1 degree away from Icarus as well. Um, so Icarus is basically sandwiched between Vesta and my descendant, both 1 degree away. So Vesta's 2 degrees away um from my descendant. And yeah, like the wanting of the partner to do these things with, but then that Vesta like solitude coming in too, like that's definitely been a huge experience that like I've personally noticed. And yeah, it's interesting how many different ways that Icarus can be like depicted or like pulled apart. Like how, it's like how are you gonna work with this energy and move forward from it?
Yeah, there's something there too about limits, like not just not
Yes.
knowing your limits, but the inevitability of limits. And I think with
Right.
Capricorn as sort of, the Saturnian as the limit and the other, like both sides of the limit, I always think of as, and like
Yeah.
Saturn is like both our limitations and our perceived limitations. Like the
Yeah.
rings are not solid actually, but they look solid. And so
Yeah.
sometimes where, it's like a, what is it? The not the seven of swords, but the, is it the eight of swords where you're like trapped?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where you're
Mm-hmm.
trapped.
Um,
Yeah. Very Saturnian image for sure.
yeah. And just like that idea, like when you were talking about like, you can do everything. you can do all of these things, but there is this limit
Yeah.
that exists. And in your
Right.
case, it was like you need somebody else,
Right.
and like you need somebody else, and you need proximity, like, and
Right.
um
Right.
and that being like a limit that you don't have, like you can't um deny it. Like the sun is going to melt the wings, like whether, no matter how, like there's nothing Icarus
Yeah.
could have done to prevent that from happening. It's like coming up against a force that can't be like denied.
Yeah.
um and I think about that with myself too, and like I've like I was just talking to my dad about like, like chronic pain, and how like getting older and like falling apart is like a real thing, but I always thought it wouldn't happen to me. Like
Yeah.
I'm different. Like I'm not, it's not going to come for me.
Right.
Like all those, and that's also very Saturn. It's like, oh, all those things you did 20 years ago, like here's
Yeah,
your
they don't work.
consequences. Like
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I'm here with your inevitable consequences. Like time to
Yeah.
sow.
Yeah.
Or
Right.
time to reap. Like you've been sowing,
Yeah.
sowing and
Well,
sowing, and like now the reaping is here. Yeah.
yeah, and
Mm.
going into that, like, the limitation thing too, and proximity, like, my Venus is in the ninth house conjunct my MC, so it's, like, the things
Mhm.
that I want to be seen as or, like, known for, like, very much always have that ninth house energy, which tie back to where Icarus's dad is in my chart in that 11th house, like, my friendships, my people, like, they always end up being far away or, like, unattainable or like long distance. Um, which like, I've just gotten very used to traveling. But there's that like proximity piece of it that I very much tie to my Venus, but also what you were saying about age too. It's like by the time the world finally opened back up to a space where I felt like I could get back into training this stuff, I'm now 30. It's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
now I'm in my 30s. Now I'm I'm a different person now. I finally got rid of the fear that I had when I was like 22, 23 and just starting, but like now I'm in my 30s. I can't do the things that I used to be able to do, even if I wanted to.
Mm,
And I carry in skills in the acro community because so many people like really teamed up during COVID and only worked with each other. It's very different world now. Like people can do way crazier skills than they used to be able to do when I was starting. So now I'm
Mm.
watching people throw these like triple backflips, and it's like, well, I didn't start when I was 3 years old. There's that age aspect. There's that Capricorn Saturnian energy that's now linked to it of like, well, even if I wanted to, I couldn't do that.
mm,
Yeah.
And so it's like, how much do I really want to pour myself into training or doing this anymore? Because I do still want it to be a fun thing, but I also have a life that I love outside of acro, which I didn't used to be able to say that. And
yeah.
so, yeah, there is the like slight limitation of like, well, this used to be the best thing ever. This used to be the only thing I really had, but like it's not anymore. And, as much as I would love to be the best at it again, or like, not that I was ever the best, but like, as much as I would love to get to that peak, it's like priorities. And so
Hmm.
it's very much the highs and the lows of all of those like accumulation.
It's so, yeah.
Yeah.
And thinking about the sun as like my teacher, Adam Ellenboss, always talks about the sun as the ideal image that we're working towards, which I
Yeah.
really love because it's like about a plot line of becoming. It's not like,
Mhm.
like meme astrology where it's like you came out fully formed as
Mhm.
as this,
Mhm.
but instead it's like that platonic, like when you think of an apple, it's the apple you have in your mind, that you're
Yeah.
it's the thing that you're working towards, and that idea that the sun in this myth is like,
Mhm.
you're questing for it, and again, it turns out not to be, or it denies you, or like you are not able to reach it, and then you have to like regroup, or the story becomes like about the aftermath of that, or the idea of the pull of the sun, and needing to
Yeah.
change what you're drawn
Change your
to.
identity. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
and it's
because it is a huge identity shift for sure.
Mm,
And it's interesting too, like looking at talking about limitations and the needing
Hmm.
to change and come up against limitations, and how that also ties back to the labyrinth aspect of this mythology as
Yeah.
well, and how Icarus is trying to escape a labyrinth, and like what labyrinth are we all trying to escape? And just thinking about that whole mythology of going through this maze and having walls on other side of you and having to go through it to
Yeah.
figure your way out is like a whole nother dimension as well that you can add to how this mythology can show up.
Hmm.
yeah, there's something there too about like, Daedalus built a prison, and then he was put in a prison, um and
Hmm.
I'm not sure exactly what to say about that, except like, if you're in the prison business,
Yeah.
you might find yourself also in prison.
And
um
you are what you put your attention to. So if you spend all your consciousness thinking about, limitations and incarceration and control, then like
Absolutely.
that is what your consciousness is focused on for your own life as well.
Yeah. Um, and I also like, as this is another example, another story, but I was doing an asteroid chart reading for somebody who was also a Cancer rising. And she had Pluto in her fifth house in Scorpio. And we were talking about how she wanted to have children, but she was scared. And I noticed that she had Icarus. Um, it was like half a degree away from her Pluto
Oh,
in the
wow.
fifth house. Yeah. And she just kept like, before I even found this, before I even looked up Icarus, she was telling me this crazy story about how like she had this huge fear of having kids because it felt like imprisonment.
Mm.
And she just kept talking about that over and over. And she was talking about like her father and how her father like tried to give her everything at some point in her life, but like he just couldn't. And like they have like a really weird, strained relationship. And I just remember seeing Icarus in her chart and being like, that's really crazy that you just talked about having kids as imprisonment, but like you literally have Icarus on your Pluto in your fifth house of children. And yeah,
That is
that
really
was a crazy
crazy.
example. Yeah.
Yeah. Hannah, you had mentioned something about neoliberalism as well and
Oh
tying
yeah.
that to Icarus. And it looked like you were
Yeah.
about to say something else too. So, like, share that maybe. But I also
Yeah.
want to hear your thoughts on how this ties to neoliberalism.
Yeah. Well, I was going to talk about the parenthood aspect and like this idea of like, um, in some ways, there's like a rhyme with Ceres and Persephone, not exactly, but this idea of like losing a child, like um, the fear
Yeah.
of losing a child, and that love can be a prison in a way because you're like so, like your heart is outside of your body, and you
Hmm.
but
Right.
you can't control it.
Yeah.
It has to make its own decisions. And that's something that's always been very hard for me to like wrap my mind around. But yeah, I when I started studying the asteroids, I was thinking a lot about Alice Sparkley Cat, who in their um, incredibly influential and important
Mm.
book, Astrology and Storytelling. Everything they write's a banger, but that was like sort of the thing that really like blew my mind when I was starting out in astrology. They talk about how you're supposed to interpret planets sort of in the context under which they were discovered. Um,
Hmm.
and so when we think about the outer planets and the non-traditional planets, we kind of have to put them in the kind of post-enlightenment context. And specifically when thinking about the asteroids, it made me think about this idea of like neoliberalism as the asteroids were being discovered, in this sort of I mean, they've been discovered over a long period of time, but um, the idea that we have to examine them in the context of a like highly individualistic um, neoliberal society and those values, and that they all of these myths kind of have shadows associated with that. And so with Icarus, again, it's this sort of like I the idea of um, flying too close to the sun because you think you're different, because you think there's like you
Mm.
can transcend a limit that is actually real, like we're
Hmm.
taught. And even in astrology, like when we think about neoliberal astrology, right, it's all like you can be whatever you want to be and here's how to use your chart to do that. Whereas like ancient astrology is like life sucks.
Right. So different.
you know here's some bad stuff, like I'm not gonna lie to you, like that's bad luck, I'm sorry about that. But it really speaks to this idea that like some people do have different, like not everyone is starting out in the same place. um and I think about that a lot with um the asteroid goddesses too, that there is a neoliberal shadow of white feminism that attends the 70s, like the first and second wave, both the suffragettes and the second wave of feminism. That we can talk about like Juno and the patriarchal bargain, we can talk about Pallas and internalized misogyny, we can talk about Vesta and like purity culture and the like
Yeah.
wellness to alt-right pipeline, and we can talk about Ceres and talk about um, this idea of like parental control that we're seeing a lot in the news, and like what parents parents trying to control their kids to protect them, which I think is a very serious story.
Sure.
And I have series on my descendants, so I'm like very I feel like super keyed into that
Yeah.
story. So I think it's always really interesting to think about how um to read against some of the interpretations, or at least read into the shadows as being the shadows of our own culture, and the idea that too that the asteroids, a lot of them, right, the main belt is between Mars and Jupiter, so it's sort of they're sort of the bridge between the personal planets and the social planets, and then the generational planets beyond. And neoliberalism is all about individualized problems to social, or individualized solutions to social problems. And so the asteroids sort of also, by sitting in that betweenness as the bridge between Mars and Jupiter, sort of like your individual actions can only take you so far in um, a collective of any
Yeah.
kind. Like,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And especially thinking of Icarus and like exceptionalism, right?
yeah.
Which is
Right.
so interwoven into neoliberalism and this whole like we are individual cells, we are all separate, we're all
Right.
living our own exceptional lives rather
Yeah.
than like us all, to be completely interwoven and to be completely
Hmm.
horizontally connected. No one can like be exceptional or special in the way that like neoliberal culture teaches us all that we all get to be special. And that's so Icarian to fly too close to the sun, right? To think that you're special, but like we're not the gods. We're mortals, we're mere humans, and like we need to have humility with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where that like fear aspect comes in, because he like did that so fearlessly, but then it was like, well, why? Like, maybe a healthy dose of fear is actually a good thing. You shouldn't live in fear. You shouldn't be too fearful, but like there's also I see Icarus very much as like that balance between the two. And I feel like even with acro there's a metaphor there too, because it's like if one person does too much and the other person doesn't do enough, it's not gonna work. Um, and
Mm,
you have to like so perfectly align so many things and like get the timing correct, and like there's so much extra like paying attention that needs to be done with Icarian, which was something I really liked about it because it made me pay attention. It made me like be fully present in my body, because if I wasn't even for a second, if I got distracted, you could get so severely injured. And so like
yeah.
even just that little bit of like fear that would kick in, and it's like, okay, like I have to be present or I'm going to get hurt.
Mm,
And so it's like that Goldilocks thing, like try to find the middle ground of like what is safe and healthy, but also like how are you still shining? How are you still getting close to the sun, but not too close to it?
yeah. Well, two things. I mean, that's really real. And like I
Hmm.
identify with that with the burnout too, where it's like,
Yeah,
don't, when you're doing too much and it still feels like not enough. And like how do you find that balance of like
Mm.
doing uh doing enough, or like doing what you're capable of doing, but not overexerting it. And I think about, I'm like,
right.
I'm like, how would Madeline Miller, because I'm obsessed with Madeline Miller, like how would Madeline Miller write that scene with Icarus, and
Yeah.
like
Mm.
what was going on there? Like if we can like really, and I think that that's like something that I've really struggled with some of these myths, is because they're all so brutal,
Right,
and
right.
so some of them really austere, and sort of like really try and get in there and empathize, like try to really like put yourself in their skin and be like, why would they do this? And I think about like Icarus must have been a child, like you think about how long it must have taken Daedalus to make those wings. I'm sure we can look it up somewhere, but however long they were in prison, like Icarus was probably a young boy. So he had grown
Right.
up in prison. And
Mhm.
now he's free for the first time in who knows how long. Like his formative years were spent in
Right.
prison, and now he has the whole world, it feels like, at his um disposal. And I think there's a story there too about like both this idea of um like you know how people will win the lottery and lose it all immediately because they don't know how
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
to hold it, you know, like that idea too of the sun. It's like the sun is too much to hold, or like it's too much to, like, you know, immortal forces are too much for us mortals to gaze upon, you know, all of
Mhm.
those things. And like at the same time, when you are deprived of something, or when you I feel that way a lot with undignified planets. It's like they're so used to struggle, or they're so used to like getting by, that like that's their reality. Like
Right.
it's so hard to get into an
Mm-hmm.
abundance mindset when you have, like, you've been in survival mode, or like your whole identity is around making it work, or like um your whole like uh existence has been about like getting trying to get resources without access, you know, like when you grow up in a house
Mm-hmm.
that's not built for you, you like have to come up with all these like workarounds to like climb up to the cabinets or like whatever it is, you know. And so then
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
you get into like something, a new paradigm, you're like still, it's like really hard to acknowledge that. Or so yeah, I
Yeah.
think about that, what that must have been like for Icarus to be like, wow, like here I am, like nothing bad can possibly happen to me because I'm like free and there's no walls anywhere and there's no limit.
Right. There's an ignorance.
Yeah, and like
It's like you didn't know because you didn't have the information
It makes
available.
me think of like
mhm.
the Fool tarot card. Like you're up
Yeah,
on this
Yes.
journey, and then tying that back to neoliberalism and burnout and how,
Yeah.
we're in these systems and a lot of them have been set up to be invisible and to be implicit and to be
totally.
systems like we have cops in our own heads at this point and we're policing ourselves so that we don't even need, like, we still have massive prisons in society and that's also part of neoliberalism, but like
Yeah.
liberalism is all about socializing people to behave in certain ways that are affirmative of like free market capitalist ideals. And if that can all be in our own heads and be invisible, and we don't even know it's there, like Icarus transcends the walls of the labyrinth and is flying away, but then the sun's like, nope, you're falling down, like you don't know how this actually works. And having that, with burnout as well, because under neoliberalism, like wages, the amount of hours that we need to work now to make the same amount of, like, to cover our living expenses, those
Yeah.
hours have gone up and up and up since the 80s and 90s when a lot of neoliberal reforms were put in place in the United States. And we all need to like hustle and grind and work constantly. And that's why we get burnt out, and it's like
Right.
monetize your hobbies, monetize your favorite things, monetize everything that you do, like literally
Yeah.
sell your Q-tips, like sell, like sell everything, right? It's
Yeah.
like just too much, and then like the weight of Icarus's wings like melting and then like you
Right.
fall.
Well, and yeah, that's heavily relatable too, because like as much as I loved acro, I felt like if I was gonna do it as much as I wanted to, I had to find a way to make money from it because it was gonna drain me of money. So that was like a huge aspect of it, was like, I have to teach this. It has to become my job. I have to perform. I have to, like I added a lot of pressure into everything I was doing because like I wasn't gonna be able to just like have a hobby, which is
Mm.
also very Capricorn.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Also, unrelated but related, I was just curious and I pulled the chart of um when I first started acro, when I first discovered it, and Pluto was 17 degrees Capricorn. Icarus is 17 degrees Capricorn for me. It was exact
Mm.
Pluto transit.
Oh.
That's interesting.
With all the Pluto symbolism I've been getting lately, I was like, I'm gonna pull that chart.
Well, it is interesting. Like I have Icarus opposite Proserpina, the asteroid.
Mm,
Um,
interesting.
and or no, I'm sorry. I think it's opposite Persephone rather. And I
Okay.
have Proserpina opposite my Venus.
And
Wow.
just so people know, Proserpina is the Roman Latin version of Persephone, so they're kind of
Right.
Yeah.
So
interchangeable.
there's a Proserpina asteroid and a Persephone asteroid, as is the case with a lot of these. You'll have
Yeah,
a Demeter. I think there's a Demeter asteroid as well as a Ceres.
absolutely there is.
And there's
But
a
I feel,
Hades asteroid. Pluto's
oh
a
yeah,
planet.
as well as Pluto, the dwarf planet.
Is Pluto a planet?
I like to say dwarf
Yes.
planet because I feel like it's like being like, I mean, kind of. Well, but I also feel like Ceres, I will like this is my hot take, but I feel like
Mm,
if you're gonna be reading Pluto in a chart, and I'm not always the best about this, you absolutely need Ceres as well. Like whether or
Mhm.
not we say Pluto's a planet, if we're going to include it, then Ceres has to be in there too. And the
yeah,
makes a lot of sense to me. The myths are related. They're basically the same size. So to me, they take up the same kind of like weight.
I
Mhm.
Um,
agree. Yeah,
They're literally siblings. They're
yeah,
equals.
mhm,
great.
mhm.
Yeah, I mean, my personal take on that is like all the luminaries and planets through Saturn like hold more, and then Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and the four goddesses in Chiron are like they all hold equal weight to me.
Mhm.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Gotcha. Yeah, and then the asteroids, I just sort of think of them as like seasoning at this point, or like a
sure.
different way, or if not seasoning, like a different like I've seen the stories that the asteroids tell in my chart in other signatures,
Hmm.
but it is just like a different way of telling that story or something. Like
Yeah.
it's the same story told in a different way. But yeah, when Icarus dies, right?
Mhm.
And like that to me means underworld journey, right? We don't know anything about Icarus's underworld journey, but like if he died, he went to the underworld. And so there is a connection to underworld like mythos. Um
Mhm.
and so um to me that was like when I went through that burnout, it like initiated me somewhat. Like I had already thought I was on an underworld journey, but then that was like when it was like, oh no, it hasn't even haven't even begun to problem. It was just like
Yeah.
a true like hatch because it's like when you're it's an ego annihilating thing
Mm.
too, right? You could think of Icarus as like an ego death story too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like wherever Icarus falls in your chart, it's going to show you the struggles that you have. It's going to show you where you're going to ultimately have really high highs and really low lows, and where you're going to find a lot of success and then also find a lot of heartbreak.
Mm,
Um, and I almost see it as like for me, like I know this sounds dramatic, but like acro felt like if I continued the way I was going, like it would have killed me. Like it would have
Mm.
like even just mentally, like it was getting to a point where I was spending it was almost like an addiction, like how I imagine like how drugs have an effect on people, like, because it was getting to a point where I would wake up every day and be like, "This is the only thing that brings me happiness. Where can I drive today?" I was spending 4 days a week driving to other cities within an hour and a half to 2 hours away from me after work. I was driving there just to
mm,
practice and then to come home, And like I was constantly tired. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating super well because at the point of which we were done, I was just eating whatever I could. Um, and like, I wasn't really taking care of myself. So like even though I very much was like at a peak of like strength and ability, I was definitely like so hyper focused on it that I was letting the rest of my life really suffer. And it had really like turned around to bite me several times. And so now that I'm like coming out on the other end of COVID, I'm like, okay, well, how can I ask for help with the acro community in Cincinnati? Like, how can I get other people involved? How can I build a community here? How can I not have to like put all this pressure on me all the time and like open it up? It's like, how can I still do this and keep it in my life, but also I need it to be healthy. I need it to be like not in the way that it has been. And it's really crazy. It's like there's definitely the huge extremes.
Hmm.
That's so interesting. Like what I'm hearing is a thread about sustainability. And like obviously that
Right.
relates to burnout and
Yeah.
stuff as well. But this
Capricorn.
yeah, exactly. In Capricorn. And like
Yeah.
that's something that I'm really still struggling with. Like I said, I used to have like, I used to write columns and I had a weekly podcast and I had all of these things that I was doing like on this kind of
Mhm.
regular basis. And I also want to speak to as well that like um with the third house being not just and I don't have siblings, so I can't really speak to the third house like sort
Sure.
of sibling thing, but I've often like found myself in unsustainable relationships of proximity where it's like, oh, this person just like is here in
Mm.
my like day-to-day life. And also like I think about social media a lot as a third house
Mm-hmm.
topic. And like during 2020 I was like in this very Capricornian like edge walker situation with social media where I wasn't like contributing anything, but I was just like doom scrolling constantly. So I felt like an outsider, but I was like
Mm.
had a very unsustainable relationship with it and was like really allowing it to affect my mindset. And so like
Interesting.
your immediate environment to me is also like the media that you're consuming, and that has an effect on your
Yeah.
mindset, right? Like your daily rhythms include like the what you're reading and
Yeah.
like consuming.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, uh so there's that aspect of it. And so like I'm trying to figure out how to have a still trying to figure out how to have a sustainable relationship with something like creating
Mhm.
content regularly, which sounds very like uh I don't know, banal,
Yeah.
but it's very
Well,
real.
it's the
And like
Yeah.
cadency that you were talking about, the
yeah,
flushing, the
Right.
cadent, like you make content
Yeah.
and then you have to make more content and then you
and
have
then you
to
have to
make
make
more
Yeah.
more
content. It's
content.
like the hamster
Well,
wheel of cadency.
yeah, well, that's so interesting you say that too, because I actually had the exact opposite experience with my Icarus situation. Because when I was doing it, I was posting my videos, and that's how I gained an Instagram following.
Oh yeah.
And I have an empty third house, but like the ties to the 11th house and the ninth house with Venus and like Icarus's father, like all of those things when I had first started to think about letting go of acro, one of the first things I thought about was like, well, I that would get rid of my Instagram following potentially because I was hoping that one day that following would like, I was getting jobs from it. I was like hoping that one day that could be my full-time thing because of it.
Right.
Like that was like I didn't care about the Instagram fame or the whatever, but I did care about the idea that like maybe this could become sustainable.
Mm,
And so it was like I became addicted to taking videos that I was taking anyway because I'm a visual person and the videos were helping me know what I was doing right or wrong. And so
yeah.
they were helping me like form the craft. But then I was posting these videos that were actually getting traction. And that was so exciting to watch a following grow. And when I first basically started to step away from it, I lost like 2,000 followers, and watching them dwindle down because I wasn't posting as much, or I started posting about other things occasionally. Like that at first was super hard to deal with because I was like,
Mm.
no, like this was a life that I thought I was building for myself. And now I'm realizing how unsustainable it is and how like it just was never going to work. I'm getting older. It like isn't reality. And that's when I ended up, like going back and getting a certificate in astrology. And like that's how I ended up here, which I'm so thankful for the fact that I'm here. But it is crazy how that like the tie of social media was so opposite for me.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
I,
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely felt that pressure to like be putting stuff out, and at a certain point, I just like something in me like snapped, and
Yeah.
I
Sure.
can't get it back.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when you talk about your follower count, it's like, like there's Icarus falling out of the sky, like,
Right.
but it is that ego death. It's that like, okay, what do I do now? Or like what, after being humbled or after sort of
Right.
being thrown off, it's like kind of how to regroup. Um and yeah, that's something that I'm still sort of trying to figure out. And also sort of um like I have a very it's interesting because my like third house again, like um I don't have a lot of like relationships with siblings. I don't have like a lot of relationships with neighbors, but like a lot of my something that really occurred to me during COVID is like, oh, I don't actually have like a lot of these people aren't actually my friends. We're just like all in the same place at the same time all the time,
Mm.
which is a
Interesting.
very kind of Capricorn thing of like what's real.
Yeah.
Capricorn is like the arbiter of the real, or Saturn is the arbiter of the
Yeah.
real, or like
That's
what's
so that's so interesting because like once again, same but opposite. Like all of my friends, like I always feel happiest and safest when I'm at either astrology conferences or acro festivals, which I have to travel for. And they're very ninth house. Like I always have to take a plane because there's nothing in close proximity to me ever. And I always have to go far away to feel like I'm in those communities that bring that type of safety.
Which it's just so interesting hearing like both of your stories and the ways these
Yeah.
show up and the ways that we are all living our own individual versions of these collective myths, and coming back
Yeah.
to Hannah's connection to neoliberalism and the fact that a lot of asteroid theory was developed like in the second half of the 20th century when a lot of neoliberal policies were being implemented globally. And so
Yeah.
it's like we are individually living these stories, but they are collective stories, and they're stories that extend back across thousands of years. They're stories that extend forwards, and like the ways that they show up for Lori is different than the ways they show up for Hannah, is the different than like the ways they show up for our listeners, but there's the threads that connect them as well. So that's what's really striking me listening to you guys sharing both of your like ways that this shows up for you.
Yeah. It's so funny to me too how opposite they are. Like literally the same stories, but like in the most opposite ways. It's like mine was very top of the chart public and yours is very bottom of the chart internal private.
mindset, very internal, and like
Yeah.
trying to explain your own like mental right, because it's normal to you, because
Mhm.
you're inside it, like a fish doesn't know what water is, right? That kind of thing. It's
Yeah.
interesting too, like the host of that Jupiter and Icarus is my Saturn in the first, and like thinking about things like
Mhm.
in the past, like I have chronic pain from like running too much on pavement when I was a teenager, and that
Mm.
feels very Icarus, like I overdid it and now I'm paying the price. um
Yeah.
or that this feeling of like identity tied up in my productivity and my ability to like the ability of my like the abundance of my communication, as like it's this idea that it's a never ending resource, and then all of a sudden I like kind of found the end of it, and like what does that mean, and like will it ever come back? It's like in the magicians when like the magic runs out and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, but we really didn't plan for that. Like so how do
Right.
we, like what do we do now, and like will it ever come back, and like can we be okay with it never coming back? Like what would that mean?
Yeah.
Hmm. Wow. Well, should we start wrapping up a little bit? This is beautiful.
Yeah, this is so great. I do want to say real quick, just like funny, because I was talking about my card of the day. I pulled the sun today and I pulled this mug out.
mm,
So,
and now
Oh,
we're talking about
that's
Icarus.
and now we're talking
amazing.
about Icarus. So that's just actually really funny because this was a
Yeah,
total accident. It was the first mug in my dishwasher that I pulled out. So,
beautiful. Does
yeah.
anyone have any final thoughts about Icarus or anything that we've been chatting about before we kind of share what we have going on and wrap up the episode?
I just feel a lot of gratitude for being able to take some time to talk today and just like connect over. I mean, to me, that is really what I get out of astrology, and especially what I get out of the asteroids is like, I am not the type of astrologer who loves throwing out like a lot of numbers and relationships and information. Like that kind of goes over, like when that language is used, I don't absorb it, you know, and some astrologers are
Mm.
like very technical and good at that, and they can talk about declination and solar arc directions um and all these kind of layers of complexity. And what I really love though is just telling stories with people and
Yeah.
Mm,
sharing and having conversations and hearing the planets talking when people talk, like
mhm.
Right.
listening to people's stories and listening to these myths, and like and hearing the planets talking. And so
Yeah.
um
Yeah. I think there's something to be said and like so important about like just sharing your stories and learning so much about
Mhm.
yourself as these things happen too. Because there were so many connections that I even just put together today about Icarus in my chart because of your story, and
Mhm.
it's like, oh, right. Like I noticed it play out this way, but I didn't realize it actually plays out that way too. Or there's just so many layers to all of this. And once you start peeling them back, you start noticing just how many there really are. And the way to do that is to talk and to listen and to research and to read and to look into these stories and see how they play out in your own life and journal about them, really.
Yeah,
yeah.
like myth and story are so alive,
Yeah.
and they're, parts of oral tradition where every time the bard or whoever told the myth, it would be slightly different and it would be unique to that group right
Yeah.
there. And like, I love jam bands and jam music. I'm a big Grateful Dead fan, and I just like love going to jam shows. And it's like there's something when you're at a live jam show that just happens right there in that room. Like, you don't get it on the recording, you don't get it anywhere else. And I think there's something about that with myth as well, as each version of
Yeah.
the myth has its own little flair. And seeing how like our lives are embodiments of these broader stories is just really, really beautiful. So thank you both for
Absolutely.
sharing so
Yeah.
much. And we always wrap up by just sharing a little bit about like what we have going on right now. This episode will probably be shared in late February, early March. So, Lori, do you want to share kind of what work you have going on right now?
Yeah, just to go back into the asteroids, I am writing a book right now, so if anybody has any stories or anything you want to share, feel free to reach out. Um, And I do offer asteroid readings as long as or as well as everything, any other types of astrology readings. Um Otherwise, I don't think I have too many big things going on. Just wrapped up some Valentine's Day deals and
Mm,
yeah.
nice.
Mhm.
What about you, Hannah? What do you have going on?
Gosh, well, if you are in the Portland, Oregon area, you might be able to catch me doing readings at drag shows around town. And otherwise, I am in the middle of kind of redoing my booking and scheduling situation. And I really consider myself like a word of mouth astrologer. Like
Same.
discos do. I don't really advertise. So, if you are interested in a natal chart or an office hours reading, so natal chart is like birth chart, office hours is like if you have a specific topic or question, like about transits or a specific event in your life or something. Um, you can go ahead and shoot me a message on Instagram. And otherwise, I am very excited about some stuff I have brewing in my art studio. My astrology practice is an outpouring of my art practice. I consider it to be a form of time-based found object art. So um, I'm really looking forward to maybe in the spirit of what we've been talking about today, getting into a more sustainable relationship with sharing myself again. So I'm hoping
Hmm,
that that will begin to manifest in the weeks and months to come.
very exciting. I'm excited to see what will come from that.
What about you? What do you have going on? You're in ski season,
Yeah.
is that right? Snow season?
Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm just skiing in Utah a lot, so I'm not doing too many readings or offerings, just really trying to rest and like the plants are not very productive right now in the winter, so neither should we. I have been doing some writing and reflecting. I wrote a blog post about how to build relationships with our ancestors and practice ancestral veneration. And I have a collection of blog posts about different herbs. I've been doing a lot of research for my herb school, Artemisia Academy. So I have blog posts about dandelion and calendula and elderberry and probably like 15 different herbs at this point. So yeah, we'll have links for, how to reach out to Lori, Hannah's Instagram, my blog. We'll have links to all of that down in the show notes for people who want to engage more with us. And as always, if you guys have any stories, like our listeners, as in you guys, if y'all have any stories or anything that you want to share with us about how asteroids show up in your life, any questions about asteroids, any thoughts at all, like please reach out to any of us, leave us a comment. Like it's just really exciting to, we all went to this retreat with Demetra George to talk about the asteroids, and she described herself as Johnny Appleseed, just trying to like
Yes.
spread these seeds to the wind and spread asteroids out into the community. And we, I hope you guys would agree, want to be a part of that. I think that's kind of why we're here doing this episode. So just
Yeah.
happy to engage with folks as they have, things that come up about asteroids.
I'm so excited for this podcast. I've been listening a little bit and I'm excited to see
Oh,
what else you come out with. So thank you so much for
Mm.
having me on. It's been a
Yeah,
pleasure.
thank you,
Appreciate
Hannah.
you.
absolutely. Thank you for coming
Yeah.
on.